Hi. Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I'm your host, Darkness the Curse. Special thanks to all my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains torture. 5 of the worst trains ever. Part 21. This series is old enough to drink! The Baldwin 60,000. Now, I want to stress before I even begin that the reason I put this locomotive on the list is because it is a failure in the financial and commercial sense. But on paper, it really isn't that bad. Let me try to explain. The Baldwin 60,000 was actually a celebratory build conducted by Baldwin themselves, in recognition of their, 60,000th locomotive. From a design standpoint, they were trying to make it so that this would be the best locomotive they had ever built, period. It has 3 cylinders, weighs about 318 tons, including the tender, and was rated to haul about 6,400 tons, with a top speed of 70 miles per hour. It's actually a high-pressure steam locomotive, and I mean high pressure by the standards of the time. It was built in 1926, and its boiler pressure ran at 350 psi. Towards the end of the steam age, some other locomotives would get pretty close to that by default, but in the 1920s that would have been considered high pressure. It had a lot of really innovative, unusual technology in it too, like a water tube firebox, which was meant to improve efficiency. It also was actually a compound locomotive. She could expand the steam once inside the cylinder, and then again in the 2 outside cylinders. She was meant to stand as a model for future development, and Baldwin was taking a big risk when it came to making her at all. See, generally, when it came to companies, especially back then, a locomotive builder like Baldwin would often wait to receive orders with specifications for locomotives from the buyer. The railroads would tell them what they wanted, and they would build it based off of their instructions. Oh hey UP, what's up? We need big chungus. Here you go! We love it! They did occasionally do it like this, where they would build a design on their own and then sell it later, but there was more inherent risk, since with the former plan, when the railroad approaches them, they already have a buyer lined up for what they're building. In the 60,000's case, they had to sell it, and by sell it, I mean market it, convince the railroads that they would want it. And that's where she fell completely flat. No one wanted her. At all. They received 0 orders for what was, at the time, one of the most technically advanced locomotives on the planet. Why? Why on earth would nobody want her? Well, there were a few reasons. For one thing, that water tube firebox I mentioned. Yeah, see, those tubes were actually prone to burst inside the firebox. They hadn't really worked out how to prevent that. That was a bit of a no-go. Also, her being a compound worked against her, because while that did improve efficiency, most US railroads had actually rejected the entire idea by the 20s just because it complicated the workings and the maintenance of locomotives. Also, she was big. Really big. She was a Ford 10 driving wheels in the 1920s. Due to her weight and length, she wasn't suitable for most lines. Only the heaviest and straightest rails could accommodate her. And as a result of all this, she received no buyers. Which is unfortunate because you gotta appreciate what Baldwin was trying to do here. It shows their technical prowess. Even though she is flawed, they probably could have worked out the kinks, and she could have been great, but she never had the chance. Fortunately, despite the fact that no one else seemed to love her, Baldwin did. They kept her around, and eventually donated her in 1933 to the Franklin Institute of Science in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And she's still there today. The EMD/Progress Rail SD70ACe. Boy, howdy, that designation is a mouthful. I'm just gonna call it the AC. I think that'd be easier to say, in general. This locomotive is actually a pretty recent build, first running in 2004. They were built by EMD not because they were looking necessarily to make a new diesel, they had to, due to EPA Tier 2 emissions regulations. Their older models didn't cut it. They had to develop something new to actually meet those standards, and out popped the SD70ACe. Now, at the time, these diesels were equipped with the latest technology, and EMD did wind up producing quite a few of them, just over 2,000. They were constantly built between 2005 and 2015, when EPA Tier 4 regulations came into effect, making it so that EMD couldn't build these either. They had to make something else again. And from a mechanical perspective, they did function. Like, they could move around. The engines were fine. The problem was, well, partially the engines technically, but also the cabs. For one thing, they were nicknamed Thunder Cabs by railroaders. Because there was a problem with the... Please shut that off! These things are loud. So loud. They were loud enough that BNSF banned them from leading trains due to them being so obnoxiously loud. And they caused excessive vibration. Crews hated it because it was noisy and shaky. And that wasn't the only issue. The cabs just weren't very good at all. They had a very unique design. Outwardly, they looked pretty standard for comfort cabs, but they weren't internally. There actually wasn't that much space inside of them. A collision also determined that the cabs weren't actually very safe. The cabins were prone to being separated from the main unit and flattened in collisions, which, that's actually horrifying. Did they fix that? No, they never actually fixed that. Most of them are still in service at this point, because, again, they do work, but I wouldn't want to be the crew on them. The MK Rail MK5000C, which I am again just going to call the 5000C. Why do all these modern diesels have to have the longest designations in the universe? You know, I think EMD started this trend. What is the matter with you? These diesels were actually built by MK Rail. If you haven't heard of them, I don't really blame you. For a long time, they actually did rebuilds of existing diesel locomotives that were originally built by EMD and General Electric. But in the early 90s, they decided they were going to compete directly with those companies by building their own unique diesels. Now, at the time, on paper, the MK5000 should have been pretty impressive. It was 5,000 horsepower, and when it was introduced in 1994, it was the most powerful single prime-mover diesel-electric locomotive ever made. The reason for this is that MK chose to use a Caterpillar diesel engine, specifically a Caterpillar V12 3612. That engine was huge. It actually remains one of the largest engine blocks used in rail service in North America in general. It was an insanely powerful engine, and on paper it should have done really well. Except that I've discussed Caterpillar engines being used for rail service before. They don't work well for this context. See, there are a lot of different forces that get applied to locomotives that don't get applied to other vehicles. Caterpillar is known for construction equipment mostly, backhoes and excavators and bulldozers, relatively slow equipment. It doesn't get jostled around all that much, at least when it comes to the actual engine. But on a locomotive, that's not the case. Not only is the engine traveling at a much higher rate of speed in general, but stopping applies a ton of different forces. Then there's also the act of coupling and uncoupling, which can cause vibrations that it wouldn't be accustomed to. The point is, the engine wasn't built for this. First of all, they didn't sell, any at first. Demonstrations were pretty unsuccessful, and MK Rail didn't have a lot of money for the program. Before any railroads committed to purchasing them, they terminated the program entirely, so they never even really got a chance to do anything. There were 6 built, though. They were leased briefly to BC Rail, and then they were finally sold in 2001 to the Utah Railway, a Class 3 railroad that operates in, Utah and Colorado. They wound up taking all 6, and the diesels didn't even last 1 year. Seriously, every single one of them failed within a year of operation, due to problems with the main bearings on the Caterpillar diesel engines, as well as the Cato main alternator. The Caterpillar engines just didn't cut it. They couldn't handle the active railroad operation. So they were sent back to MK, which was actually now Wabtec because they were bought, to have both their alternator and their engines completely replaced with EMD equipment. They were reclassed with the designation MK50-3, and they were put back into service. After they were re-engined and completely changed, they actually were totally fine. They're actually still in service now. Not with Utah, though. They were sold to the Kyle Railroad instead, a regional railroad line that runs in north-central Kansas into eastern Colorado. So yeah, the 5000s were garbage, but at least they got re-engined and work now, so that's something, I suppose. The Reading Company C1A class. Now, there are several reasons why you don't see this very often. This is a 444 locomotive. Now, these locomotives were built pretty well. 4 of them were produced, and they were so committed to the 444 layout that their front trucks and rear trucks were basically identical. But physics can be a very cruel mistress in some cases, and as it turned out, this setup was not good. It did not work very well, due to instability. Like, dangerous, very, very dangerous instability. Like, these things will absolutely kill somebody. Instability. The crews couldn't keep them under control, and they threatened to fly off the rails at any waking moment. After a year of this nonsense, trying to fix the problem to no avail, they rebuilt them entirely to 442 Atlantic locomotives. Apparently dropping those extra 2 trailing wheels fixed them, because they were fine after that. They were reclassified as P7SAs. For the record, not every 444 was necessarily a failure, but a lot of them wound up being rebuilt. It seems like it's just not the best wheel arrangement overall, likely down to an adhesion issue. That was probably an issue with the C1As too, but no one really noticed, because the crew was trying not to die. The Heilmann locomotive. What the... I don't even know where to begin. Why? Why do I find this stuff? Why must I enter this domain? I just need to keep reminding myself that I chose this path. I just really didn't think I'd ever get this far. And now I'm looking at something that I don't even know how to begin to describe. The Heilmann locomotives are actually a group of 3 different experimental locomotives that are considered steam-electric units. Let me say that again, just so we're clear. These were steam-electric locomotives, and I mean a serious attempt at this idea. I'm not talking about Switzerland's weird ones, because those I understood in their situation with the coal shortage. It makes sense for them to do that. This was built this way from the ground up, and the way these work is not the way you think. Okay, let me try to explain this madness to you. The first prototype was built in 1894 by a man named Jean-Jacques Heilmann, who registered a patent for a self-powered electric vehicle. The design was intended to eliminate the unbalanced oscillatory moments as well as hammer blow that was caused by the cranked action of a conventional mechanical steam locomotive. It used a balanced steam engine to drive the locomotive via an electric transmission. Heilmann was a bit of a dreamer and a big thinker. He wanted to create a machine that was very suited for high-speed trains, but without high costs of electrified infrastructure. Electricity was still pretty new in the late 1800s, and the infrastructure wasn't all there. Railroads weren't necessarily keen or simply couldn't afford to invest. This way, they could have some kind of electric vehicle, but not have to have the extra infrastructure. The earliest design was of a train set consisting of a vehicle with a triple expansion steam engine, as well as a generator, a tender, and 3 carriages. The whole train ran on bogies, all of it, and it used a distributed traction system provided by 12 axle-mounted electric motors in the 3 carriages. So it almost sounds like an EMU, but with steam? Okay. But the first real locomotive was a prototype of just the locomotive. It had a boiler, the steam engine, the electric generator, and motors built into a single locomotive. It was named Fusée, or sometimes called La Fusée Électrique. In English, that means the electric rocket. The final product wound up with a 600 to 800 metric horsepower, 2-cylinder horizontal compound steam engine with transversely mounted cylinders of 425 and 650 millimeters. It was supplied with steam by a Lentz-type boiler. The engine had a fixed cutoff with no reversing mechanism at all and no speed governor, excluding a centrifugal overspeed safety device. The firebox was of a stainless corrugated type. The steam engine was used to drive directly a DC dynamo, rated for 500 kilowatts. It was a 6-pole machine with the armature constructed on the Graham dynamo principle with 6 brushes. The generator's field coils were energized by a separate bipolar dynamo capable of generating about 100 amps at 100 volts. That's 10 kilowatts. which was directly driven at approximately 300 RPM by a 20 CV, 2-cylinder vertical compound steam engine of similar design to the main engine. So yes, it had 2 different steam engines for this. This second generator's output was also used to provide a supply for electric lighting in the carriages. So that's nice. Electric speed and load control was obtained by reducing the main generator's field excitation current coming from the 10 kilowatt dynamo using a 12-step drum rheostat. The 8 traction motors, I repeat, 8 traction motors were connected in parallel. For low speed control, the motors could be series connected in 2 sets of 4 that were also connected in parallel. The motors were located in 2 4-axle bogies, with wheel set having a sealed axle mounted 80 to 100 metric horsepower, giving it a dodo wheel arrangement. It was actually a cab forward design too, because Heilmann really just wanted to make the whole thing weird for the late 1800s. Now, as ridiculously complicated as this is, believe it or not, tests show that the design actually kinda worked. It used 50% less coal than a conventional steam engine would have, and it rode extremely smoothly. But the problem was everything else. It was complicated, very complicated, and thus maintenance of it would be a total nightmare and very expensive. Also, it was rather heavy for the rails of that time, and no further examples of this prototype were built. But Heilmann was not done. You fools! Do you think you could stop this man? This is Jacques Heilmann, and he moved on to even bigger ideas. He built 2 more larger prototypes in 1897, 8001 and 8002. They once again were of a similar concept, steam engines that drove an electric generator. Because that's how this is happening now. The things weighed 124 tons and were 28.35 meters long. Once again, they didn't actually function, and believe it or not, this time, some railroads did show some interest, but still decided against it in the end, just due to the complicated nature of this idea. Steam engines were already a thing. They knew how they worked, and they knew how to make them function. Why add electricity on board of a steam-fueled thing? It just didn't make any sense to them at the time. But in Heilmann's defense, this tech was very ahead of the curve, actually. Yeah, they weren't picked up at all, and they failed miserably. But these designs are actually ancestors of modern-day diesel-electric locomotives, which do use diesel engines to create electric power. It's a similar concept. It was just using steam instead of diesel. It didn't work, and nobody wanted it, but Heilmann was ahead of the time thinking outside the box. And you have to give him credit for at least being very creative. He was obviously pretty smart. He did something unique. It didn't turn out well, but I give him props for the attempt. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, 72267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hawk 444, Benjamin Owens, Pigeon Consume 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Arrow Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Racer 78, and Crystal Morgan. Till next time, this is Darkness, the Big Roll of Fond, farewell.